My name is Frank DeSandy. I work for Boeing in Huntington Beach right here. And I have in my hand a book that I picked up at the then McDonnell Douglas Library about 15 years ago called Management in Small Doses. I thought, well, this looks interesting. This is something I can read over a period of time. I didn't have to cram it all down immediately. Needless to say, I read it in one sitting. And I went to the library immediately and I asked them if I could buy the book from them. They wouldn't quite let me buy it then, but about 6 months later they called me and said, "Hey, come get it, you can have it." I think I did pay for it actually. So it's been, it's now mine. It's very important to me. I'm going to ask Dr. Ackoff to sign it a little later. But this is the book that introduced me to the concepts of Dr. Russell Ackoff that you'll be hearing about today. I'd also like to mention that the restrooms are just outside here, just past the counter on your right. There's a tall counter, like a guard counter, check-in counter. And in case of emergency, we'll please file out this way and head right out to the parking lot. And there are telephones available in the lobby area. If any of you are interested in signing up for the Deming discussion group that meets here on the second Thursday of every month, please feel free to do so. There's a sign-up sheet in the lobby. And if you're a Boeing employee and you're charging this to training and would like training credit, there's forms so that you can get training credit out there in the lobby as well. So please feel free to do that. Right now I'd like to introduce Dr. Bill Bellows, the leader of our Enterprise Thinking Network. Dr. Bellows?
Hey, good morning. About a year ago, Frank and I, and about 20 of us from Boeing across Southern California had the good pleasure of meeting Dr. Ackoff when he spoke in Los Angeles. And then since then, we thought about bringing him in-house, how exciting that would be. And I talked with Tim Violet, who sits in the office next to me, who runs a program called Passport to Leadership. And Tim was very interested in bringing Dr. Ackoff in, and I called up Frank and said, "What do you say we bring him to Huntington Beach as well?" And I knew he wouldn't take long for Frank to say yes to that. And so here we are. We've got him here today. He was in Canoga Park yesterday, and I just want one change in our schedule. We're going to take a break at 10:30, 15-minute break, and then break for lunch from 12 until 1, and then we'll break in the afternoon at 2:30. At the end of the day, we had thought of doing a panel discussion, which we will not do. We're going to let Dr. Ackoff go until 4:30. There's plenty of stories. In fact, what I find fascinating about his work, embedded in the stories are some great principles, and the stories are fascinating. And it's like the role of an example is to help us understand a concept. I look at it as an example, as a bridge between how we currently think to how we might think in the future, and people are looking for, give me an example, which is like, give me a bridge. And hopefully what people walk away with is a great understanding of the principle. The principle can be applied. The bridge may not be what you use that time. The bridges he provides you with will last a long time. I know a year ago I heard these stories and then heard them yesterday, and they really hold the test of time. Now I want to introduce a good friend, Bill Cooper from San Diego, who was a moderator of our panel yesterday. And Bill had some thoughts he wanted to present you with as we start our day.
We did end yesterday with a panel, and we decided Dr. Ackoff had a heck of a lot more to say than I did yesterday on the panel, and your opportunity should be there. I just wanted to share with you a couple of thoughts about Dr. Ackoff. For those of you who are management, for lack of a better term, groupies that read a lot of different things. There's probably three people in my experience as a manager and a trainer and a teacher to some degree that had major influence on me. They were Peter Drucker, Dr. Deming, and Russell Ackoff. How many of you are familiar with TQM, Total Quality Management? How many of you are familiar with the quality management boards? If you remember the Quality Management Board, Russ will probably talk a little bit about that. I was kind of the founder of those in the Department of Defense. But they came out of a book that I read in the early 80s written by Russ called Creating the Corporate Future. And he's got a great new book out called Recreating the Corporate Future. But I just wanted to really take this one opportunity to say sometimes in your life you get a chance to see and hear a living legend, and who not only has a philosophical view of the world that's very, very, very broad, but also has an understanding of systems like none I've ever seen. Dr. Deming had the theory of a system, but Russ does an outstanding job of putting it in terms that we can all understand. So the stories, while meaningful, are always tied into a practical theory that you can use and you can learn from. So I just wanted to add my thoughts about the gentleman you're about to see, that probably is one of the most preeminent management theorists and system thinkers that was ever in this country. And now I'll introduce Russ with the same thing. He said, with that kind of an introduction, I can hardly wait to hear what I'm about to say. Russ Ackoff.
Thank you.
There are a bunch of old friends here. When I arrived yesterday, I was uniformly greeted by each one separately who said, "Boy, you look good." Translation is, "My God, you're still alive." One of them had the guts to say to me, "How long have you been teaching? Can you remember the first class you taught?" Well, I can. It was in September of 1941. I had just finished my undergraduate work and entered graduate school and had an appointment as an instructor in the department. But what I remember most about the first class is what happened immediately before it. I was called in by the department chairman, who happened at that time to be Wes Churchman. Some of you may be familiar with his work. He said to me, "You're about to start a career of teaching, and it will either be hell or heaven, depending entirely on whether you understand one simple characteristic of the job." He said, "What you have to understand is what you say and what they hear are two entirely different things." Well, I didn't know what he was talking about until I read my first set of examinations. And then I discovered. But a little while ago, we were working in Canada with the Imperial Oil Company, which is Exxon Canada. And the head planner there told me a story about his prime minister, which better illustrates the difference between what is said and what is heard than anything I'd experienced. So I repeat it for your sake. He told me that Mulrooney, who was the prime minister of Canada, had come down to work with George Bush the elder on the design of the North American Free Trade Act, NAFTA. And they had spent 3 very productive days together putting together that act, at the end of which they sat in front of a fireplace to have a parting drink, chatting, before Mulrooney left to go home. In the course of that conversation, he turned to Bush, he said, "George," he said, "you have a marvelous staff. I've watched them over the last few days. They reduce your workload significantly. I wish my staff did the same thing." He said, "My staff is terrible." He said, "They add to my workload continuously. How do you get such good people?" Bush said, "Oh, it's simple." He says, "I have a little examination which I use as a filter, and it separates the good staff from the bad staff people." And Mulrooney said, "Well, can I see it?" He said, "Well, better. I'll give you a demonstration." He picked up the phone, got a secretary, said, "Send Dan Quayle in." A few moments later, the vice president came in. Bush introduced Quayle to Mulrooney, and he said, "Dan, I have a question for you. Your father had 3 children. One was your brother, one was your sister. Who was the third?" And Quayle stood there deeply in thought. And after a moment, he lit up. He said, "I got it." He said, "Me." Bush said, "You're right. You can go now." He left. Mulrooney said, "Now, come on. You don't mean that simple question tells you the difference between a good and a bad staff member?" And Bush said, "It never fails." Mulrooney said, "I don't believe it, but I'm desperate, so I'll try it when I get back." Well, when he got back, he called in Clark, the deputy prime minister. He said, "Clark, I've got a question for you. Your father had 3 children. One was your brother, one was your sister. Who was the third?" And Clark stood there deeply in thought. And after a moment, he said, "Look," he said, "Boss, that's a tough one. Give me a little time, I'll think about it and come back to you with the answer." And he turned around and slowly left the room, was walking down the hall with his head bowed when he bumped into Wilson, the Minister of Finance. "Hey, Wilson," he said, "maybe you can help me." The boss gave me a tough question. He said the following. He said, "Your father had 3 children. One was your brother, one was your sister. Who was the third?" And Wilson looked at him with complete amazement. He said, "You can't be serious. The answer is obvious." Clark said, "It is." "Well, what is it?" And Wilson said, "It's me." "Ah," said Clark, "I got it." And he ran back into Mulrooney's office, broke in, he said, "I got the answer, boss, it's Wilson." Mulrooney said, "No, you're wrong, it's Quayle." Well, I hope we don't have that kind of difficulty here, but there's one way to be sure, and that is if you feel free to break in at any time when you think there may be a mismatch between what I'm saying and you're hearing, and through discussion perhaps we can clarify it. This is a little clip that appeared in the New York Times about 12 years ago. It recognizes the fact that in the last half of the last century, there were an increasing number of people who recognized that we were going through a profound cultural change that you refer to either as a change of age or a change of era. Now, you can find this reflected in the literature, although no common name to this change has been yet assigned. Drucker called it the age of uncertainty. Rifkin called it the age of access. The information age has been called the knowledge age, the systems age. There are all sorts of names. It's not surprising. Do you know how long it took for the word Renaissance to be attached to the 2 centuries to which it's now identified? The term Renaissance wasn't used until 1850, more than 200 years after the period. So we shouldn't be in too much of a hurry to get a name for the era we're going through now. One of the things we have come to understand is what an era or an age means. It's a period of time in history that's held together by a common world view, a common concept of what the nature of reality is, and a common concept of how to inquire into that nature. So there are 2 components to a worldview. What is reality, and how do we find out what it is? Now, relative to this, Einstein made a wonderful, simple, but very profound observation. Let me get this thing. This is a new one for me. Oh, here it is. Without changing our pattern of thought, we can't solve the problems that were created by that pattern of thought. Now, the significance of this is Einstein's talking about one of the 2 parts of our worldview, the way we conduct inquiries. In a given culture, you absorb the way we conduct inquiries by osmosis in the process of growing up. So you would have great difficulty if I asked you to articulate the way you conduct inquiries, you probably couldn't do it. But you'll probably recognize it when it's shown to you. The method that permeates our culture that has begun to go through a change began with the Renaissance when the conduct of inquiry we call science began. It's the same method of inquiry you can observe in any child. Not an infant, but a child say from 2 to about 5 years old. When given an object they've never seen before and left alone with it, and they want to know what it is and what it does, what's the first thing they'll do to it? Take it apart. Then they try to understand what the parts do, and then assemble the understanding of the parts into an understanding of the whole. And until managers understand that that's the current pattern of thought and what difficulty it gets them into and why the new pattern of thought that's emerging is so critical for effective organizational life, we're in a mess. The basic pattern of thought of the Western world for the last 400 years is called analysis. Analysis became synonymous with thought. If you have one person confronting a problem saying, I analyzed it, another one confronting it saying, I thought about it, you'd have difficulty telling me what difference there is between what they did. Because analysis was the way of thought and still is the dominant method of thought in the Western world. And it consists of the 3 steps we've already reviewed. The first thing you do is take the thing you want to explain, understand, apart. Ideally, you would take it apart to its ultimate indivisible parts. So science became a crusade in which the Holy Grail was the indivisible part or element. In physics, it was a search for the atom. In chemistry, it was a search for the elements that were in the periodic table. In biology, it was a cell. In every science, there was a search for the ultimate part because the belief was that to understand anything completely, you would ultimately have to understand the ultimate parts of which it was composed. So the first step of analysis was take it apart. That's equally true of a corporation. If you want to understand a corporation, you take it apart. Production, marketing, finance, personnel, and so on. And the first thing you have to do is understand each part taken separately, which is the second step of analysis. In the third step, you aggregate the understanding of the parts into an understanding of the whole. So if you go to a business school, you take courses in the parts. And at the end, hopefully, you'll get some kind of a seminar or some opportunity to try to integrate it all into what you believe is an understanding of the corporation taken as a whole. So analysis then was the dominant mode of thought. But in the 1950s, for the first time, we began to understand that certain paradoxes arose because of analysis, that certain problems emerged which we could not solve using analytical methods. For example, let's take a few simple ones. How many of you have ever been to England? Good. You know they drive on the wrong side of the street. Why? Do you think that if I gave you British automobiles, by taking them apart, you could find out why they drive on the other side of the street? Of course not. The typical American car, the standard American car built between the two world wars, was a 6-passenger vehicle. Why? Why wasn't it 7, 5, 4, 9, 15, any other number? Why 6? Do you think taking it apart will tell you? What we began to recognize is there are certain things called systems which you cannot understand by analyzing them. When you analyze a system, you learn something, but you don't get understanding. Well, what do you get? If I take a corporation apart and get to understand what each of the parts do, what have I got? I don't understand the whole. What I know is how the system works. The result of analysis of a system is knowledge. And for the first time in the 1950s, science distinguished between knowledge and understanding and recognized that all of the work of science has produced is knowledge, but not understanding. That understanding requires a different method of thought. Now, to understand that difference and its significance to management, it's absolutely essential to understand the concept that made us aware of this distinction, and that is the concept systems. That came to the fore in the scientific world in 1954. A German biologist by the name of Ludwig von Bertalanffy had migrated to Canada because of Hitler's persecution of his religious group, and he wrote a book called General Systems Theory. That book itself is not so important as the concept on which it focused, because we began to think about what a system is. And when we did, we began to make some very important and significant results, conclusions out of the nature of systems which affect the concept of management and organization. And that's what I want to show you today. So, we got to understand what a system is first. First, a system is a whole which consists of 2 or more essential parts. Now, every system is defined by the function it performs in a larger system. So if you want to understand what an automobile is, you have to identify its function in society of which it's part, or the transportation system of which it's part. An automobile is defined as a device for carrying people from one place to another under their control and in privacy. You describe the function of the automobile. A computer. You don't define a computer by its structure or what it does, but what it is used for. It is a device either for communication, word processing, and so on. You define things by the role or function they have in a larger system of which they're a part. And this carries on all the way up to the largest system of which we're aware, the system we call the universe. If you recall your history, Newton said that the universe is a system. Following Descartes, the great French philosopher who was the first major philosopher of the Renaissance, he said the universe is not only a system, but it's a mechanical system. It's a machine. And then he identified exactly the kind of machine he said it was. He said it's a hermetically sealed clock. Now, he didn't mean it was like a hermetically sealed clock. Newton said it was a hermetically sealed clock. It is the device by which we ultimately tell time, the movement of the planets. It operates with a regularity dictated by its internal structure and the causal laws of nature, which he thought he had formulated. It's hermetically sealed. Contains everything. There's nothing outside. No environment. Now here's the puzzle. Here's a system that contains everything. How can it be a part of a larger system? But if it isn't, we can't define it. Well, this might bother you or me, but it didn't bother Newton, because he found a larger system. He came to a conclusion which affected almost every major institution in the Western world. He said the universe is a machine created by God to do God's work. So you see, he gave it a function. The critical point is, remember that every system is defined by its role or function in a larger system of which it's a part. To understand it, you must understand that role or function. To know it, you must know how its parts operate and what they do. Now, the new method of thought that was required to get to understand the system derived out of this paradox. A paradox which derives out of the very nature of the system and the characteristics of the parts of it. Let's look at those parts first. These essential parts have to satisfy three conditions. Oh, I'm sorry, you don't have copies, do you? You'll find they can't get this thing to work backwards. And I skipped one. I hit this thing a little too hard. There are three conditions written in your slide, but I'll tell you what they are, but you can find them there. You can do it over there. Yeah, you can hit the button. That's it. Thank you. Each part can affect the behavior of the whole or its properties. That's the definition of an essential part. An essential part is a part without which a system can't perform its defining function. So for an automobile, for example, the motor is essential because without a motor it can't carry from one place to another. The fuel pump is, the battery is. Windshield wiper isn't, the cigarette lighter isn't, the ashtray isn't. You have certain essential parts, your heart, your stomach, your lungs, your brain, without which you can't live. But you also have a lot of unessential parts. Your fingers are not essential. In fact, your hand isn't essential. You can live without a hand, you can live without an arm. You can live without both arms. You can't live without a brain. So the essential part is one which enables the system to perform its defining function, and it can affect the behavior or properties of the whole. As I mentioned yesterday, I was talking to a group of doctors recently, and when I gave this condition, one of them immediately objected. He said there's one part of the human body that's not known to have any effect on it at all. And I've heard that very often, but I couldn't tell him I had. So I pretended to be surprised and asked him what part that was. Now, what part did he name? Appendix. Appendix, of course. What does the word appendix mean? Add-on. It's an add-on or an attachment. If they ever find a use for the appendix, they have to change its name, right? The appendix of a report is not a part of the report. It's what's added on to justify the expense. It's an add-on. Every essential part can affect the behavior or properties of the whole. But the way it can do that depends on at least one other part. No essential part has an independent effect on the whole. So the way the brain affects you depends on the lungs, because the brain requires oxygen, which is provided by the lungs. On the other hand, the lungs cannot operate without appropriate signals from the brain. They're interdependent. But they depend in turn on the stomach, which produces the energy indirectly that is required for the lungs to operate. Another way, therefore, of saying this second condition is that the essential parts of a system form a connected set. That means between any two essential parts you can find a path, however indirect it might be. So if you take the fuel pump in an automobile and the battery, you can find a path between them ultimately. You take the brain and the stomach, there's a path between them. They form a connected set. Now, if you take the essential parts and group them into what are called subsystems. In the human body, there are three subsystems: the motor subsystem, the nervous subsystem, and the metabolic subsystem. These subsystems have the same two properties as the parts do. Each one can affect the whole, and none of them has an independent effect on the whole. They are also interdependent. If we take those three conditions and put them together, then, okay, now we can film.
I'll push it back.
Okay, here. Then we can come up with some of the essential properties of a system. First of all, the properties of the whole derive out of the way its parts interact. Its functioning depends on the interactions of its parts. And therefore, when you take a system apart, it loses all of its essential properties, and so do its parts. It's a very critical property of a system. If I brought an automobile in here and disassembled it, although I kept every part in this room, I don't have an automobile, because the system is never the sum of its parts. It's the product of their interaction. If I put you on a surgical table and disassemble you, okay, I won't have a living thing. I'll have the elements of a living thing, but life is a product of the interactions of your parts, not a property of any of the parts taken separately. The incredible thing about an automobile is no part of it can move you, but the automobile as a whole can. The body can't move you from one place to another, the axle can't, the motor can't. And furthermore, when you take the car apart and put the motor on the floor, it can't move anything. It moves the automobile when it's a part of the automobile. But when it's removed from the system of which it's a part, it loses all of its functions. So that you cannot think without a brain. You might think you can, but you can't. But if the brain is removed from your head, it doesn't sit on a table and think. The brain cannot think. You can think with the brain. The heart is a pump, but when removed from the body, it doesn't pump anything. So therefore, when the system is disassembled, it loses its defining properties, and so do each of its parts. Now, here's the system that we want to understand. It could be the automobile or driving in England. And the method of thinking that's available is analysis. Therefore, what's the first step that we apply to the system? What's the first step of analysis? Take it apart. But what happens when you take a system apart? It loses all of its essential properties, and that's why you can't understand the system by taking it apart. So we needed a new way of thinking, which would allow us to understand the system without taking it apart. Not surprisingly, that's an entirely opposite process to analysis. It's called synthetic or synthesis thinking. In the second step of analysis, you try to talk and understand the behavior of each of the parts taken separately. The opposite of that is to try to understand the behavior and properties of the containing whole. So if I want to understand the university, I have to first understand what is the function and properties of the educational system. In the third step of analysis, you aggregate the understanding of the parts into an understanding of the whole. In the third step of synthesis, you disaggregate the understanding of the containing whole by identifying the role or function of the thing you're trying to explain, and it is explained by that identification. So these three steps are diametrically opposed to analysis. Analysis yields knowledge of a system. Synthetic thinking yields understanding of a system. And as you'll see later on, these are entirely different things. Knowledge has to do with questions that begin with the words how to. How do I get from here to San Francisco? You tell me, that gives me knowledge. That's instruction. If I say, why do you want to go to San Francisco? I'm asking for an explanation. Understanding lies in explanations. Now, the defining characteristics of a system define on how its parts interact and not on how they act taken separately. And this leads to a consequence, which is probably the first, in a sense, earth-shattering consequence of systemic thinking, to management. Management operates on the assumption, I did it again. Management operates on the assumption that the way to manage a system is divided up into parts, like strategic business units, divisions, or departments, arranged for each one to run as well as possible, and then the system will, as a whole, will run as well as possible. That by improving the parts taken separately, you can improve the performance of the whole. And that is absolutely false. But it's counterintuitive. And so management continues to operate by the effort to improve parts. And then I say it's wrong, it's false. And the response I normally get out of executives in particular is, what are you talking about? How can you explain all the successful corporations if they're all being managed incorrectly? Well, surprisingly, that's easy to do. Do you know how many new corporations we have to create in the United States each year to have one that will survive the first year? 23. We have 22 failures in the first year for every success. Do you know what the average life of an American corporation is? 14.5 years. Over 50% of the American corporations on the Fortune 500 list 25 years ago don't exist anymore. You all know what the Dow Index is? It's made up of the price of the blue chip stocks, right? Only one of the corporations in the original Dow Index exists today, General Electric. Every other one has disappeared. We're lousy. The strength of the American economy does not lie in what people think it lies in. It lies in its ability to survive the amount of inefficiency we have in it. No other economy can tolerate 22 failures for one success. But we can, and that's the strength of our economy. But what it demonstrates is a tremendous opportunity for improvement by getting it right. So the 1 out of 22 that survives is much more a matter of luck than a matter of competence. You know, if you shoot at a target 23 times, you're likely to hit it at least once. And then you say it's because you took the right aim. It's not very likely. Now, this is absolutely true, but how do we know it's true? Well, there's an elaborate proof in system sciences to show that this is so. I'm not going to take you through it because it involves set theory, which is fairly complicated in mathematics, and I don't remember it anyhow. But I want to first give you an example that'll show you that it's true and why it's true. I'm going to ask you to do something that Galileo did when he was under house arrest. As you remember, Galileo arose in support of Copernican theory that the sun, not the earth, was the center of their solar system, and as a result, he was arrested and put under house arrest for heresy by the church. He conducted a great deal of his research in isolation, in house arrest. And he did it by doing what are called thought experiments. He conceived of experiments that were so simple they could be done in the head. And that's the kind of experiment I'm going to give you to do right now. It starts with an observation made by the ultimate source of all knowledge in the United States, the New York Times. According to the New York Times, there are 457 different automobiles available in the United States. Suppose we bought one of each and brought them into a large garage. That's the first step. So you have to now have a picture of a garage with 457 different make model combinations in it. Now we hire 100 of the best automotive engineers in the world. Bring them into that garage and ask them to find out which car has the best motor. Well, they'll conduct a series of tests. My guess is they'll come to consensus on the Rolls-Royce motor. I tell you, the Rolls-Royce has the best motor. So I make a note of that, Rolls-Royce motor. You say, now let's try the transmission. Well, perhaps they come out and tell you the best transmission's in a Mercedes. Make a note of that. What about a fuel pump? Well, maybe the Buick has the best fuel pump. What about braking system? Well, maybe that's the Cadillac. And one by one, we take every essential component of an automobile and find out which is the best one available. You got the picture? Now we tell the engineers to take those parts off of those cars and put them together into the best possible automobile. Because now, for the first time, we will have an automobile that consists only of the best available parts. Question, do we get the best possible automobile? Of course not. In fact, I'm asking you the wrong question. Do you get an automobile? You don't even get an automobile for perfectly obvious reasons. Why? Parts don't fit. Performance of a system doesn't depend on how the parts perform taken separately. It depends on how they perform together, how they interact, not on how they act taken separately. Therefore, when you improve the performance of a part of a system taken separately, you can destroy the system. I take what's probably not, maybe the worst car available in the United States, I don't know. Certainly the Hyundai isn't the best. According to Consumer Reports, it's underpowered. The motor isn't really strong enough to give you the acceleration you need. Well, it means that it needs a stronger motor. So let's put a Rolls-Royce motor in a Hyundai. It's a better motor. Will you get a better car? No. Car won't work because the rest of the car is not designed to work with a Rolls-Royce motor. It's how the parts work together, not how they work separately, that determines the performance of the whole. Now, this has some interesting consequences which only one profession recognizes, and that's architecture. You have to look at the way an architect works to understand and grasp the essential significance of this systemic principle. I used to be an architect. That's how I started my career. I can recall very clearly the first house I had to design. A family came in to see me. They had just bought a lot out in the country outside of Cleveland. It was a beautiful lot which they took me to see. It was built on the side of a hill, down in the ravine and the creek at the bottom. They said they wanted a house built into the side of the hill that they would enter from the top level and have a lower level below it. They wanted the top level to have a living room, dining room, and kitchen all in one big open space, 3 bedrooms with a bath, 2 baths, a powder room, and a utility room for clothes washing and stuff like that. Down below, they wanted a large room for the kids to play in or to hold parties in, a study for the master of the house that could double as a guest room, a bath, another utility room for the furnace and stuff, a 2-car garage with a workshop in the back of it. They wanted contemporary architecture. They even told me they wanted to build out of redwood on the outside. And after all this explanation, I said, give me a little time, I'll make some sketches, and you come back and we'll talk about it. Have you ever watched what an architect does when the clients leave? What does he do? He draw a sketch of each room and then say, how do I put the rooms together into a house? Is that what he does? No. He draws a picture of the house. No rooms in it. And after he has a concept of the whole, he'll put rooms into it. And then he looks at the rooms and he says, boy, this bedroom is terrible. It's too long and narrow. It's not a good room to be in. I have to increase the width and reduce the length. And then he applies a system principle which managers never do. principle is this: I'm going to change the room in an effort to improve it. But the criterion for determining which change to make is the one that makes the house best, not the one that makes the room best. In fact, the architect will do something I have never seen a manager do deliberately. He will make a part worse in order to make the whole better. He can discover that by making the bedroom a little shorter and a little less comfortable, it will make the house more livable. I learned this in that first house I designed in a very interesting way. After the house had been completed and designed and contracts let, but before construction began, the housewife called me. She said she'd been thinking about the house which she had fallen in love with and was very anxious for it to be built, she could get into. But she was worried about the fact that the playroom or party room was down below the kitchen. She had a set of stairs which she would have to climb continuously, taking hors d'oeuvres and drinks and food and cookies and milk and up and down the stairs. She said, "Can't we put a dumbwaiter in?" And I told her, of course we could, but it would take counter space from the kitchen. And that would make the kitchen harder to work in. It would significantly reduce the counter space. And she said, "I don't care. I want the dumbwaiter." Now she got it. But she made the kitchen worse, but made the house better. Now that's something you don't see managers do. It's because without knowing it, she understood a system. The house was a system. And you don't improve the house by improving the rooms taken separately. It's only by taking their principal criterion, their effect on the whole. Secondarily, of course, if you can improve the room and the house, you want to do so. But if you can improve the house without improving the room, you want to do that as well. So that's one of the first fundamental impacts of systemic thinking on the way we manage. As this indicates, the prevailing concept of management is entirely different. It's essentially divide and conquer. And that's why we have so many failures. Because we have corporations with successful parts and unsuccessful wholes. So among the most important things a manager needs to know is how the parts of a system interact and how these interactions affect the performance of the whole. Not how the parts act, but how they interact. This tells you why business school education isn't worth a damn. It's a waste of time except for one fact, one characteristic. You see, when you go to a business school, what you do is learn about the parts taken separately. There's a purchasing department, there's a manufacturing or production department, there's a sales department or marketing, there's an insurance department, a tax department, and you take courses in each of these things taken separately. And the assumption is that when you know each of those parts taken separately, you're going to understand the whole, and that's not so. What's important about production is how it interacts with the other functions, not how it acts. What's important about marketing is how does it interact with finance and personnel. But the marketing department is absolutely scared to death of telling them about the way it interacts because they think that diminishes their importance. And they try to magnify their importance by declaring their independence of the whole of which they're a part. And as a result, you don't get educated. You learn a lot that you have to unlearn after you get out. The only good thing about a business school education is it gives you a ticket to a job where you can learn something about management later. It's currently estimated that 95% of what managers use on a job, they learned on the job after they had unlearned what they had learned in school. School is not a place where you learn deliberately, you learn accidentally from others and from what you do on your own rather than what they do to you. Because education is not built on an understanding of systems. Yeah.
So if I take it a step further, what you say about business school is basically true about the education process as a whole.
You couldn't be truer. That's absolutely so. We'll talk a little later about the failure of the educational system. Do you know that the United States is the only developed country in the world with an increasing illiteracy rate. Our performance in math and science on the worldwide scale is 37th. You know, we're terrible. And we won't face that fact, and so we don't improve. I'm going to come back to these issues later, but that's absolutely true. We have a defective educational system, and the reason it's defective is something we want to understand. Okay? Are there any other questions? Now, that's the basic idea of what a system is. And what I want to do now and spend the rest of the day on is looking at its implications for management and organization. We cannot cover them all because they're very numerous and very profound, but we can cover a number of them. And I want to start by an observation that the way experience is organized is not the way universities organize them in the disciplines. You see, you come out of school, and I did too, believing there are such things as physical problems, chemical problems, biological problems, psychological problems, social problems, economic problems, production problems, marketing problems, finance problems, religious problems, philosophical, all these problems, and there are absolutely no such things. The word in front of the word problem doesn't tell you one damn thing about a problem. So if I tell you this is a mathematical problem, it doesn't tell you anything about the problem. It tells you something, but not about the problem. And we only have recently begun to understand that. But what's even more important is its implications for the way we manage. So first, let me show you that the adjective in front of the word problem doesn't tell you anything about the word problem. There's an area just north of the University of Pennsylvania where I spent 25 years. It's called Mantua. It's 80 city blocks with 22,000 people. And in the 1960s, it was 100% black. It was what is called an urban black ghetto. It was referred to in the city of Philadelphia as the bottom. Its crime rate was the highest in the city, had the highest rate of dropout from school. It had the highest percentage of children born out of wedlock and single-family homes. The highest percentage of its population on welfare. It was the bottom. 3 young men organized a group called the Young Great Society and undertook a self-development effort in the neighborhood. And what they did is now history. Their effort has now been the subject of 7 national television programs, most recently on 60 Minutes. They've received 17 national awards, and the process of self-development, which they created, is now in practice and in use in 62 cities throughout the United States. Fortunately, when that effort began, they came to the university, and I happened to be one of the people there, asking for assistance, which we provided. And that led to a very close and intimate relationship which has persisted over 40 years. We would meet regularly to discuss the problems the neighborhood had and what the faculty and the resources the university could do to help them. And it was during one of these meetings that a critical incident occurred. They were meeting in my office on a Monday morning when a young man from the neighborhood came in with a piece of news that stopped the meeting dead. There was an 83-year-old woman who lived in the neighborhood who had organized what we referred to as a geriatric set. She had organized the older people, mostly women in the neighborhood, and the major thing they had done is they'd opened 3 infant care centers. Not daycare centers, but infant care centers. They took babies 3 months old and kept them to 3 years old, at which time they went to a daycare center. This released mama to go back to school or go to work. And so they had a major impact on the welfare rolls immediately in the community. They got from the state agricultural department seedlings and planted trees throughout the neighborhood. They cleared lots that were full of rubbish and debris and made recreation and relaxation spots out of them. They removed graffiti. They did all kinds of great things. We were able to do one thing for her. She had a rheumatic heart, but she had never had adult medical treatment. Why? She lived at the northeast corner of Mantua, and the closest medical facility was the Presbyterian Hospital 2 miles away. She couldn't walk 2 miles. There was no public transportation in Mantua. It was too dangerous. She couldn't afford a taxi cab, so she went without medical help. We took a house in the middle of the neighborhood, converted it, and the Hospital University of Pennsylvania, which, by the way, is the largest university-based hospital in the world, opened a free clinic in the middle of that neighborhood. And for the first time in her life, she was able to get a monthly checkup. She had gone that morning, they'd given her an EKG and the other tests associated with heart. She had passed all the tests, and she was released to go home. She walked home, which was a few blocks away, climbed the stairs to a 4th floor a bedroom. It was a big old house, and she was up on the 4th floor of it. She had a heart attack on the 3rd flight of stairs and died. Now that's the news that was brought to us. There was a silence in the room for a while, and the first one to speak up was the professor of community medicine, Dr. Sam Martin. He said, "Damn it, I told you we don't have enough doctors in the clinic. If we had more doctors in the clinic, we'd be able to make house calls, and if we were able to make house calls, things like this would never have happened." Well, that was clearly true, so there was no comment, there was silence. But the economist, Frank Adams, spoke up next. He turned to the professor of community medicine. He said, "Sam, there's no shortage of doctors. There are plenty of doctors. They're not in the clinic, but they're all over the city. The problem isn't a shortage of doctors. The problem is she couldn't afford one. Now, if her welfare payments were larger, or if she had a national health care plan, she would have been able to pick up the phone and call a doctor who would have come to her." Well, that was equally true, so silence followed. The youngest professor there was a professor of architecture, Larry Goldfarb, who said, "Why don't we make them put elevators in those buildings?" And then, after another silence, the only woman on the faculty who was in the room spoke up. She began by shaking her head and said, "What a pity. You don't know a damn thing about that woman, do you? Don't you know that she was married as a teenager, shortly thereafter gave birth to a son, and was almost immediately deserted by her husband, who she never saw again. She did menial housework, but raised that son with loving care and attention, and he was brilliant. He went to public school in Mantua, graduated from high school in the area, the top of his class, competed for the mayor's scholarship, got it, and entered the University of Pennsylvania, where he got a Bachelor of Arts in Science and graduated cum summa laude. Got a scholarship to the law school, went to the law school and graduated at the top of his class, was hired by the largest law firm in Philadelphia. He is now a senior partner in that law firm. He's married and has 2 young children. He lives in a beautiful house out on the main line, which is the fanciest suburb of Philadelphia. And that house happens to be all on 1 floor. Now, if she weren't alienated from her son, she'd be living with him, where she'd have all the money she needs and no steps to climb. Now, here's your midterm examination question. Is that a medical problem, an economic problem, an architectural problem, or a social work problem? None of them. What's the adjective tell you?
Proposed solution.
Tells you the point of view of the person looking at the problem. Lo and behold, every problem a doctor looks at is a medical problem. Every problem an economist looks at is an economic problem, or else it's not interesting. One of the two. The adjective doesn't tell you anything about the problem. Our experience isn't organized that way. And that has significant consequences. When you get a headache, how do you handle it? Do you do brain surgery? Of course not. Why don't you do brain surgery? After all, the pain is here. You take a pill which contains a chemical. You swallow it. It dissolves in the stomach, the chemical is released, it enters the bloodstream, which carries it up and deposits it on the brain, on the pain center of the brain. The person who developed that pill understood how the system worked, what the interactions were, and took advantage of it, because it turns out in a system, the best way to treat a problem is seldom where the problem appears, because of the interactions of the parts. So you don't do brain surgery. Maybe you could cure a headache by doing it, but it would be stupid. You found a much better way by taking a pill. But that's not what happens in management. A marketing manager comes in the morning and discovers the sales are going to hell up in New England in the last quarter. What's he say? Oh boy, I got a marketing problem, right? And now he tries to solve it by manipulating marketing variables. He tries to cure the headache by brain surgery. In my experience in over 400 corporations, over 90% of the problems that management has to confront are best solved someplace other than where the problem appears. But in almost every case, they try to solve it where the problem appears. I want to give you one example taken out of industry to show you how awareness of the system as a whole can enable you to get a degree of effectiveness you can't possibly get by treating the problem within the component of the whole in which it appears. There's a company called the Champion Paper and Fiber Company. Its headquarters in New York. It has, since the story I'm about to tell you, it has been purchased as a part of International Paper. At the time, it was a separate corporation. They have a plant in Hamilton, Ohio, which produces what is called coated papers. Coated papers are a very high quality, expensive paper that's used in art journals and books because of its particular capability of receiving color photographs. It's the shiny, high-quality paper you see in expensive journals and books. They're the largest producers of that kind of paper in the United States. We had done some work for that company, and a couple years after that, I got a call from the production manager one day. He was vice president of the company. He asked me to meet with him in Hamilton, Ohio, where this coated paper was produced. I did. He told me that the output of that plant, measured in terms of tonnage of paper produced per day or week, had gone down by 20% in the last 5 years. That made the operation of the plant marginal. It was barely profitable and certainly was not earning the cost of the capital employed. He said, it's a problem. So I went to work. The first thing that occurred to me is an old plant, he said. Maybe the equipment isn't running as well as it used to. So I had time studies done on the output rate of the 8 assembly lines, because the paper was produced on a continuous line that began with wood pulp at one end and wound up with the cylindrical rolls of paper at the other end. He showed me the output of that study, and there was no change in 5 years in the production rate of those lines. So he said, well, the next question was, if it's not the operational lines, it must be that they're down for repair and maintenance much more. So he recuperated all, resuscitated, or whatever you want to call it, all the maintenance and repair records, tabulated them, showed them to me. There was no change in 5 years. So by the time this difficulty arose, the company was producing 2,700 different papers. But in the last 5 years, they had added 500 new papers. They were now up to 3,200 papers. And that explained the reduction in productivity. How? If you have a fixed production facility and you increase the number of products that have to be made, what happens? You have more production runs, shorter production runs, and what takes the additional time? Setup. He said the trouble is setup time. He then made a plot of setup time. And he showed that setup time was increasing exactly at the same rate that output was decreasing. He said, there's my problem. He had identified his headache. Now, he said, is there some way of scheduling production to minimize setup time? Brain surgery. He asked me that, and I got very excited. I said, yes, there is. And it's very propitious that you asked that, because this is a classical problem in network theory. And it's only about a month ago that the first solution to that problem was published. It was published by a professor at MIT, and we can use it in this case. But I said, I better warn you that even if we get perfect scheduling, you may not save much money, because the amount you can save depends not only on the efficiency of scheduling, but the accuracy of your forecasts. He said, well, is there some way we can determine whether it's worthwhile going ahead? And I said, yes. And he agreed to a simulation on a computer, the operation of the plant for the last 5 years, in which we assumed perfect scheduling and a perfect forecast. You see, going backwards, we could assume they knew exactly what they had to make. Then we ran the plan under those two assumptions and compared it with the actual costs. And if the cost difference was large, then it was worth going after. But if it was small, it's not worth the trouble. And he agreed to all that. So we went back and started to do that. And in the course of doing that, we made a discovery that shocked us. 8% of the products accounted for 100% of the profit of the corporation. Accounted for 8% accounted for 90% of the production. Now, why is obvious when you know the history. Some of these products had first been introduced in 1812 when the company was created, and they still carried them. So we went back to the manager and said, look, your problem was created by the addition of products to the product line. 92% of your products are not profitable. Why don't you reduce the product line? You get a hell of a lot more saving that way than you can by improving production. He said, no, you can't do that. We said, why not? He said, the product line is under the control of the marketing department. Good, we said, we work for marketing, we'll go talk to them. No, you won't, he said. Well, why not? He said, if you go there and ask them to help me solve a production problem, they'll think that gives them the right to come in here and tell me how to run my plants, and I don't want those bastards in here. You stay away from marketing, he said. Well, we argued, but it didn't do us any good. So we went back to scheduling, but we cheated. We got the computing center to make a run of the 3,200 products produced by the company, from the most profitable to the least profitable, with the amount produced in each year, the last 5 years, the amount sold, and who it was sold to. Then we started at the bottom of the list and said, if we start to drop products from the very bottom, work our way up, how many products will we have to drop to get the same saving we would get if we had perfect forecasting, which we'll never get, and the new scheduling method? That was an interesting project. It turned out the answer was 4% of the product line. And that was less than the number of products that had been introduced. So he said, boy, great. We went back to see the production manager, and he blew his top. He said, I told you to stay out of the product line. It's not my business. Well, we argued with him. Didn't do any good. And finally, we had an idea. We said, tell you what, we'll go to marketing and tell them we're there against your will, and tell them why you don't want us to go there. And if, despite that, they come in and interfere with you, we will complete this study at no cost to you. He said, put it down on paper. So we wrote this peculiar agreement and went to New York, where I met with the vice president of marketing. I went through this story with him step by step, and he agreed with everything I said until I came to the end. And then he said, you can't do it. So why not? You've agreed with everything we said. He looked at me, he went like this, he said, I'm going to teach you a lesson. And boy, he did. He said, what kind of paper is at the bottom of your list? Well, I read the bottom of the list, and I gave him the number 421-65 or whatever it said. And I didn't ask him the number of the paper. What kind of paper is it? I said, I don't know, and it doesn't make any difference. He shook his head. He said, you're going to be hard to educate. He said, all right, let me start over. Who bought that paper last year? I looked at it, I said, you made one sale. It was sold to account 95-62. He said, I didn't ask you the number. Who bought the paper? I said, I don't know, and I don't have to be a genius to know it doesn't matter. Because what I do know is you sold 2 pounds of that paper. The smallest quantity you can produce is 2,000 pounds. At the rate of 2 pounds a year, you're going to be here till infinity to use up 1 year's production. It's stupid. He said, no, it's not stupid, you are. Well, I was a little shocked. I said, I don't understand. He said, I know you don't, so let me try to explain it to you. He said, did you ever hear of Clara Booth Luce? I said, of course I did. He said, who is she? So I told him she was, of course, a popular authoress at that time, active in politics in the beginning of the women's movement. He said, very good. He said, you know whether she's married or not? I said, yeah, she's married. He said, good, do you know who she's married to? I said, yeah. Who? He said. I said, Henry Luce. He said, very good, you know what Henry Luce does for a living? I said, yeah, he's chairman of Time, Life, and Fortune. He said, very good. He said, do you also know he's our largest customer and he bought $44 million worth of paper from us last year? And do you think I'm not going to give her a lousy 2 pounds of letter paper and run the risk of losing his business? Now, that's not the lesson yet, because an academic always has a reply to that kind of an assertion. I said, how do you know if you don't give her the 2 pounds of letter paper, you're going to lose his business? And then I learned the lesson. He said, I don't know. And you can be damn sure I'm not going to try to find out. He wasn't going to run the risk, however small it was. It wasn't worth it. Well, we argued, but it got us nowhere, so we left him like a whipped dog with our tail between our legs and went back. Now, we were really frustrated because we were convinced that the way to deal with the problem was to reduce the product line, not to fiddle around with production scheduling. And we reached a point of desperation in which it occurred to us to invoke a principle called Hitch's principle in science. Charles Hitch was a member of the Rand Corporation during World War II, who later became a professor at the University of California and ultimately became president of the University of California. And in a rare moment of clarity, he made the following statement. If you can't solve the problem you're facing, you must be facing the wrong problem. And that turns out to be a marvelous principle. We said there's something wrong in the way we're formulating the problem. The problem is we want to increase the productivity of this plant, and we've assumed that the only way to do that is to reduce the product line so fewer products have to be produced. In effect, what we've assumed is the only way to produce fewer products is to reduce the product line. We no sooner said that, and we saw another way of reducing the number of products produced. The salesmen were paid a flat salary plus a commission. The commission was a percentage of the dollar value of what they sold. We designed a new compensation system for the salesmen in which the base salary was the same, but the commission was a percent of the profit of a sale. So for 92% of the products, they would get no commission. But when they sold a profitable product, their commission was much higher in the new system. And they were set in such a way that if next year they sold the same thing they sold this year, they would earn exactly the same amount of money. But they could sell as much of the unprofitable stuff as they wanted, wouldn't affect their income. When we had this system worked out, we went back to the production manager and showed it to him. He looked at it, he said, that's kind of cute. He said, but that's not under my control, that's under the control of human resources. He said, but they don't try to run production, you can go talk to them. So we did. The vice president of human resources thought it was an interesting idea. He said, let's try it for 6 months. In one of the 5 regions in which they had divided the country was the Northwest, and they did. The results were astounding. 65% of the products in the product line were never sold. Sale of the profitable products increased by 18%. Corporate profit from the region doubled. Salesman income went up by 225%. And the effect on the factory was 4.5 times greater than you could get with perfect scheduling and a perfect forecast. What kind of a problem was it? Was it a product line design problem, a production scheduling problem, or a salesman compensation problem? It's none of them. It's a problem. There are different ways of treating it. Any one of them would have made an improvement. But it's only by understanding the system that you can figure out what's the best way to do it. And most of the solutions currently being given to problems are far from the best one that's available. Is that clear? Any questions about that? Okay, well, let's take our break here, and then we'll take another one of the implications of management when you come back. One of the problems that confronts the speaker who's talking to an audience that contains some people who have heard him before was illustrated by what happened during the break. Several people came up to me and said, "You going to tell a story about?" And there are ones which I hadn't, but since two people asked me about one particular story involving the refrigerator, and since it illustrates the point about that problems are not divided into disciplines, I'll use it before moving ahead. This is a story, when it goes back a number of years. It took place at General Electric Appliance Park in Louisville, Kentucky. They had just recently built the beautiful building there, which housed one of their major divisions that makes large household appliances. And the largest selling of the household appliances is a refrigerator. And General Electric had and still has a very major share of that very large market. We were sitting in the boardroom with a group of executives, and the boardroom was very unique. It was the showroom of the company. So it was a very large room. I would say it was about twice the size of this room. And along the sides, there was an example of every appliance that General Electric had ever made and offered to the market, successful and unsuccessful. And there were two of each appliance, one assembled and one disassembled, standing side by side. So you had a dishwasher assembled and the dishwasher disassembled beside it, and then the washing machine, the dryer, and so on. The problem we were discussing involved the refrigerator, which is the largest selling appliance and the most profitable. The problem was that every refrigerator model had to be made in two versions, a left-hand door and a right-hand door. Now, a left-hand door is a refrigerator that opens from the left. It's hinged on the right. A right-hand door is a refrigerator that opens from the right and is hinged on the left. Which you have is a function of the nature of your kitchen. Because if you're against the wall on the right, you're going to have to open from the left and vice versa. Now the problem is that for every market area, General Electric had to estimate how many left-hand door and right-hand door versions of each model they would sell. And what happened, you could guess. At the end of the year, it would become apparent that in New England, they had overestimated right-hand doors and underestimated left-hand doors. But in Texas, they had overestimated left-hand doors and underestimated right-hand doors. And so they were always left with an inventory. But that wasn't the problem. The problem was lost sales. Reflect on it. You moved. You see, the average length of time of an American family in one establishment is only 5.5 years. Most refrigerators are sold when people move or remodel. You decide you want a General Electric refrigerator, say 18.5 cubic feet, standard size. You go to a dealer and say, I want to look at the GE refrigerator, 18.5 standard size. And he said, oh my God, he said, I hope you're not going to ask for a left-hand door. Why not? Well, I only have right-hand doors. Now you need a left-hand door. Will you buy a right-hand door refrigerator? Of course not. It's incredibly inconvenient. What will you do? You change brands. They estimated that 20% of their potential sales were lost because of the imbalance of inventories in the field. That was the problem. Brain surgery. How can we improve our forecasts of left and right-hand doors? Now, we're sitting around the boardroom table with all the executives of the appliance division, and I had a graduate student with me. I frequently took a graduate student on a problem like this because I never knew when I might need an idea. This particular student, his name was Fred Hansmann. He was a Fulbright scholar from Germany. He is now a very well-known and prominent professor at the University of Munich in Germany, but he was a young man then. He's sitting beside me. We were facing the wall in which they had a refrigerator. And while we're talking about the problem of forecasting, he got up and walked over to the wall where a refrigerator was standing. He looked at it for a moment. I could see him over there, his back. He went to the side of the refrigerator and picked up a door. It was an empty door, just disconnected. And he brought it over, and it was exactly the same door that was on the refrigerator that was assembled. Then he turned it upside down, and he held it up. And it worked, because the door was exactly in the middle of the side. So it could be turned over, and it was still the right door. Trouble was the hinges were all wrong. And furthermore, the shelves were upside down. The shelves were now upside down. So he put the door down and pulled out a Swiss penknife, which had a Phillips screwdriver on it. He unloosened some screws, pulled out the plastic insert, which held the shelves, turned it around, put it back in, screwed it in. He now had a door that was absolutely the same as the opposite side door. The trouble is that he couldn't put it on a refrigerator because the mounting was on the wrong side. So he came back to the table. He said, what you currently do is put the hinges on the frame of the refrigerator. He said, suppose you put the hinges on the door instead of the frame of the refrigerator, and put receptacles on both sides of the refrigerator into which the hinges could plug. So you can take a door and plug it into the hinges on the left-hand side, and if you move and want to change to the right-hand side, you simply take the door off, turn it upside down, plug it in the other side, put a metal plate over the two receptacles, take a screwdriver and turn the shelves upside down. They did it. Today, you cannot buy a refrigerator that doesn't have a reversible door. See, the solution to the problem was not where it was identified as a marketing problem for forecasting inventories, to avoid inventories. There's a problem of product design. It was a product that could be looked at as a problem of product design. Okay. One of the other things about problems you don't learn in school is that there are 4 ways of treating a problem. The 2 of them, at least, you will recognize well. The 3rd you might. The 4th one you probably never heard of. So let's take a look. First way, absolution. What we do with a lot of problems is ignore them and hope they'll solve themselves and go away. Particularly if you're a parent. Your children are fighting. You say, let them alone, they'll work it out. And they're sensible. They'll find a way out of it. We actually had an administration of the United States in which this was the explicit policy of the presidency. That was Eisenhower. When Eisenhower came into the presidency, the condition of our economy and our culture was pretty much upbeat. Everybody seemed to be fairly fat and happy. So Eisenhower said, let well enough alone. Don't muck it up. Let nature take its course. Don't rock the boat. Intervene as little as you possibly can, because it's the people who try to make it better to screw it up. That was his position. And during that period, that wasn't a particularly bad strategy. We got through his presidency in fairly good shape. So we handle a lot of problems by doing nothing. It's the same as handling them by default. The way we handle most problems, and certainly the way managers handle most problems, is problem resolution. The problem arises, and the first thing you say is, did I ever have a problem like this before? Well, as a matter of fact, I did. It wasn't exactly the same, but it was similar. How did it differ from this problem? What did I do in the previous case? Did it work? It did. Well, how do I adapt it to the current situation? And so what you do is, on the basis of experience, common sense, qualitative judgments, try to find a way of dealing with the problem that will improve things, that will make things good enough. Not as good as possible, that's not what you're looking for, only good enough. And that's called satisficing. It satisfies and it suffices. That's the way managers handle most problems, and most of us handle most of our everyday problems. Experientially, commonsensically, qualitatively, and judgmentally. Problem solving, we use that term a great deal, but it only appeared during World War II. It was developed as a result of the German air invasion of England. When the Germans began the Battle of Britain and bombed hell out of England, especially the London area, the British were completely unprepared, and the only defense they had was some new anti-aircraft equipment which they didn't know how to use. And when they tried to use it, it was completely ineffective. Somebody in the British government had an idea. He called on a Nobel Prize-winning physicist by the name of P.M.S. Blackett and asked him to organize a group of scientists to study any aircraft to figure out how to make it more effective against the German bombers. Blackett organized a group of 6 scientists, each drawn from a different discipline. It was a very curious group, and as a result it got to be called Blackett's Circus. It was actually recorded in the history of the war as Blackett's Circus. And they came up with a plan for the reallocation and use of any aircraft, which the British accepted. It increased its effectiveness by more than 300%. It enabled the British to withstand the bombing long enough to develop the offensive capability. But they got very excited about this. So they said, this is a good thing, we need more of it. So they called on their leading scientists to organize groups, usually of 5 to 8 scientists drawn from different disciplines, and assign them to critical managers throughout the military. And the British military, like the American, is divided into 4 divisions, G1, 2, 3, and 4. And 1 was administration, 2 was intelligence, 3 was operations, and 4 was logistics. They wanted to put them where they could do the most good most quickly, which is in operations. This is the part of the military that deals with the enemy directly. So they assigned these research groups of scientists to all the military commanders, and they got to be called operational research. At the end of the war, this moved out of the military into universities and eventually into business. And what this became now was a systematic way of applying the methods of science to the solution of managerial problems. It's quantitative, it was analytical, it was research-based, anything but commonsensical. And it developed techniques for looking for the optimal solutions to problems, the best that are possible. Problem solving has now become commonplace. It's throughout all kinds, every company, including this one, you have all the tools and techniques that have been developed. Linear programming, inventory theory, sequential theory, game theory. I'm sure you got them all over Boeing and people using them. The question is there anything better than doing the best as possible? Now, you'd be glib if you said no, because there is something better you can do than the best that is possible. Can you imagine that? Well, it derives from 2 facts. First, no problem ever stays solved, because when the environment changes, the problem will re-arise in a modified form. So if you can find out a way that will deal with the problem through its transformations, you're a lot better off than one which does the best as possible now but allows the problem to reappear later. The second thing is that every solution creates new problems. And in many cases, the new problems are worse than the old problem that it solves. In the 1920s, the central problem in the United States was alcoholism. So we decided to solve that. How? Prohibition, the Volstead Act. Well, it didn't solve the problem, as you know. Liquor was plentifully available, illegally, but plentifully. But it created a new problem that was a lot worse than alcoholism. What was it? Organized crime. Okay. So, is there a way of dealing with a problem that will take care of its re-arising in a new form, or its solution creating new problems which are worse than the problem which they originally solved? And the answer is there is, and it's systemically based. It's called problem dissolution. In dissolving a problem, you redesign the system that has the problem in such a way that the problem cannot arise within the system. It eliminates the possibility of the problem. It doesn't keep the system and change its behavior to reduce the probability of the problem. It eliminates the possibility of it. That's much stronger. And let me give you a very elementary case first, and then a more complicated one. Some of you will recall when you were young, if you bought a package of cigarettes in a corner store, you always got a paper book of matches. You remember the book of matches? The largest manufacturer of those in the United States is a company called the Ohio Match Company, which is in Ohio. They had a lot of problems with that paper book of matches because people would not close the book when they struck a match. When you struck a match, very frequently a little bit of sulfur would come off the end, hit the other matches, ignite them, and you'd have an explosion in the hand, which would burn the hand. As a result, there were a lot of people that sued the Ohio Match Company every year for burnt hands. So they consulted their lawyers, and the lawyer said, print at the bottom, please close cover before striking. You may remember that in very tiny letters. It didn't make any difference. People paid no attention to it at all, and people kept burning their hands. Now, one day, a young man came into the company headquarters, was met by the receptionist. He said, I want to see the chief executive officer. Why? He says, I have a solution to the burnt hand problem that the company could implement without it costing it a single dollar. She said, well, what is it? He said, oh, no. He said, I want to talk to the CEO. Well, she was curious, so she called the CEO and explained, and he said, send the young man up. He did. He said, I understand you got a solution to the burnt hand problem. He said, yes, I do. He said, tell me what it is. Oh, no, you tell me how much it's worth. He said, how can I tell you how much it's worth until I know what it is? So there they were at an impasse. Well, as is usual, they got the firm's lawyers, and the kid went out and got himself a lawyer, and they came together and negotiated a contract. The moment the contract was signed, the young man said what you all know. He said, take the abrasive off the front and put it on the back of the book of matches. See, he changed the design of the matches and eliminated the problem. Now, it doesn't make a damn bit of difference whether you keep the thing open or not, because you cannot, by a spark, ignite the other matches. By redesign, it eliminated the possibility of the problem. Now, as a professor,